Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Today I'm chatting with Mike Nendick and Paul Cummins. Mike Nendick has a Master's in Organisational Psychology and Human Factors. His work involves optimising systems in human performance. He is a Senior Human Factors Systems Safety Risk Specialist with broad experience across multiple safety critical system domains, including aviation, rail, construction, roads, maritime energy and the military. Paul Cummins is an airline pilot and the co-founder and CEO of Airline Training Solutions Australia. He has nearly 40 years' experience in the airline industry, mainly in operational roles. He has extensive experience in the RAAF as a pilot, flying Macchi jets, helicopters and numerous aircrafts. And he has worked as an air traffic controller, flight service officer and trainer for Qantas on Boeing 737-800. Firstly, can I say thank you very much for agreeing to have a podcast with us today to chat about non-technical skills training on the flight deck and in aviation. And it might be great just to hand over to you for a moment to say, where are we exactly at the moment?
Paul. Okay, we're sitting actually in the cockpit of a 737-800 Boeing. Which is a flight training device used in my business called Airline Training Solutions. So it's the same as what you'd find within Qantas or the Qantas simulator. So it's set up to be an exact replica of that. It's got real Boeing controls, real Boeing seats, and the switches operate the same as it would in a real Boeing aircraft. Fantastic.
And so the noises that we can hear in the background are the aircraft as the pilots would hear when they sit in their space before they start flying?
So there's a little bit of noise from the air conditioning, and there's also the noises of the engines running as well.
Okay, fantastic. Mike, I wanted to talk to you today about non-technical skills training or soft skills training. So let's talk about that. What is non-technical skills training or soft skills?
Thank you, Sharon. It's lovely to be here. So a lot of people do say human factors non-technical skills are soft skills, and I tend to chuckle and say soft skills, they're the hard skills, they're the hardest thing to do right. So technical skills, in terms of the flight deck, moving the controls, steering the aircraft, getting it on the ground and off again, technical hands and feet skills. The non-technical skills, human factors such as communication, leadership, threat and error management, situation awareness, they are hard, but that's the critical thing to have teamwork to manage both normal and non-normal situations, which Paul trains pilots in the simulator to deal with. So it's that combination of technical and non-technical, how we interact with each other, that counts.
So why are they important in aviation?
So that's a really good question. As some people listening will know, human factors aims to improve individual performance and the wider system's influence on our behaviours. Knowing how to apply practical strategies to minimise human factors risk and improve our non-technical performance is a very important thing if we don't want to have what we call undesired consequences or undesired situations, which we will talk about. So human factors is about understanding how we think and behave and actively working to get the best out of ourselves and each other. So a definition that I like, which is human factors non-technical skills, is that we're working to optimise how humans relate and interact with the environment, with procedures, with technology and with other people. And that is all encapsulated in the flight deck environment between pilots in a multi-crew airline environment.
How does it actually help with communication?
So communication, as a lot of people know, tends to be miscommunication is often an underlying major contributing factor. Note, I don't say cause. We have multiple contributing factors in human factors investigations. Miscommunication is a major threat that can lead to undesired consequences.
I might just jump in there, Mike, as well. So communication is other things as well. There can be various barriers to communication, which can come from the people themselves, their attitude, personality, even the company profile and how they treat the pilots as well. And then there's also the risk profiles of the individuals as well. They all interact with communication.
Really good point. And that's the other side of the non-technical skills, not just how we think, but the interactions we have and the things we bring to work in our personal lives that we have to be conscious of. So things like fatigue management, risk management, threat and error management, better ways of communicating, ways of getting our concerns voiced so people take notice. Those are all part of this combination of putting the soft and hard skills together, whichever way you want to call those.
Okay, so you've talked about threat and error management and a few other terms there. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's great. So when we look at the broader view of human factors, we're looking at the organisational impacts, such as our culture, our safety culture. As we said, we're looking at our management systems, we're looking at training and assessment, competency assessment, how do we achieve what we need to achieve to get the job done. So it's the organisational level. I like to start there first in terms of threat and error management because that influences our behaviour more than people believe. The next thing we look at is our working environment, so our job, our workplace. So the flight deck is just one part of that, separate to when we're in the classroom or in the office or down the back as the cabin crew. So we don't forget we've got them as part of our team as well when the cockpit door's not locked. And of course we've got the individual, so the things we bring to work, our own stresses and strains and personalities and distractions. So in terms of threat and error management, you've possibly heard, and Paul, please jump in, of Professor James Reason's Swiss cheese analogy, where we've got layers of Swiss cheese with, I think it's called Emmental maybe, with holes in it. And if those holes line up and we don't trap hazards and errors, then we might end up in an undesired place. And that's what threat and error management is about. It's identifying threats that are things outside that could impact us negatively, so like bad weather. Potentially pilots might call air traffic controllers, so Paul and I are both air traffic controllers, so maybe we're not really a threat, but maybe we are in as much as we might have to put you in a hold or change the clearance we've given you because of other traffic that we're keeping you clear of, for example. And then of course we've got we make errors anyway, either because of the threat or it just happens. So we've got to identify them and manage them. And if we don't manage the threats and the errors, then we're in an undesired situation, which Paul might explain in a bit of a flight shortly. Maybe on final approach, we've got distracted when we went to put the gear down and we think the gear's down and then we look, oops, the gear's not down, and so go around so we don't have a nasty accident, and which is that threat and error management. Let's not get to that undesired situation.
Also, with the model that Mike was talking about, there's often a number of factors that are involved in an incident or an accident. That's not just one thing. So it can be any one of those barriers, or the mitigators can actually stop it from happening. So there might be a whole bunch that get through, but if you can stop any one of them at any point in time, then it breaks the chain, so to speak, and you'll have a different outcome. That is obviously what we're looking for, is why these things are happening and what we can do. In terms of the training that we do with the threat and error management, Mike talked about the two broader ones, but the ones that we mainly concentrate on, or that we do concentrate on in the training, is with the individual, the threats and errors related to the flight that they're actually doing. So what is it that's going to impact on them? And as part of it, we get them to brief it as part of the departure and also part of the arrival. So it's going through what's relevant to them at the time, and for every threat, they must have a mitigator.
Okay, so the walking and talking through the bringing the plane in is so that you understand what they are perceiving to be the threat and the error management, is that correct?
Well, firstly, you're making sure that the roles and responsibilities and who's doing what and the types of procedures and everything is clear between both the pilots. So it can depend, sometimes there's a choice of the way things can be done. So they talk about the shared mental model, so making sure everybody is thinking along the same lines and is tuned into what's actually happening, so that somebody doesn't miss something or there's no surprises when something happens. But as far as the threats and mitigators, so it might be weather, it might be an airport that they haven't flown into for a while, one of the navigation aids might be out, so they don't have the high precision one, so that's going to change the way that they will operate the flight. So for each one of those, they might have to ask for a different runway if it's outside of the tolerances for the aircraft as far as, crosswind or downwind or things like that. All those sorts of things. So they're mitigators.
Okay, so that's actually just made me think about something. I was assuming that the non-technical skills training only connected the two people on the flight deck together, but it doesn't. It connects the air traffic controllers and other people in the mix.
That's right.
Yeah, so we've got our immediate team, pilot flying, pilot not flying, so one's monitoring, pilot monitoring. We're backing each other up. That's why perhaps single pilot airline operations aren't a great idea unless AI gets a lot better. So we've got the economic pressures versus having someone to back each other up, because threats are things from outside. Errors happen between us. If we make an error, we need someone else watching and saying, oh, did you see that? And that's that shared situation awareness is what we're training for, so that we're looking out and knowing what's going on. And even perhaps calling down the back and saying, did you hear a funny noise down there? And they're part of the team as well. So as you say, it's not just the two people on the flight deck, it's the people we're talking to in the air traffic control, it's the engineers on the ground, it's the cabin crew down the back, it's the persons who fueled up the plane and loaded it beforehand. They're all part of the team. And sometimes when things go wrong, we have to get on the radio and call back to base and say, hey, this is what's happening. What are we going to do from here? So that's part of it, isn't it, Paul?
That's right. And human factors, in terms of the way it's perceived, has actually evolved over time. So it used to start off with
cockpit resource management.
That's right.
Yep.
And then it became crew resource management, which meant, okay, flight attendants are part of the crew as well. Then it became broader after that.
Engineers, maintainers, managers. Who would have thought, right?
And now one of the acronyms they use is SHELL to represent the model. So software, which can be documentation and things like that, and checklist, hardware, obviously what they're flying and other things like that, environment, what's happening external to the flight and the aircraft, liveware, being the person themselves, and then they added another L, which is liveware, which is interaction with other people. So both in the cockpit and, as Mike said, all these other people, everybody that's going to be involved with the aeroplane, they're part of that liveware. And
that model by Frank Hawkins back in the day. Since then, we've also added a big C, and so it's SCHELL now for culture, because everything's within that overall culture. So human factors support safety culture, looking out to try and manage hazards, which are analogous to threats, but not exactly the same. Won't necessarily go there today. But that idea that we don't live in a vacuum, so all the influences on us in terms of where we come from, both national culture, corporate culture, organisational culture, safety culture, psychological safety, they all come together in this safety critical environment of getting things right under dynamic and time-constrained situations to, get back on the ground safely and get us to where we want to go in the best way possible.
Yeah, and CASA actually have a number of different models. I was doing some reading a couple of weeks ago, and there's 3 or 4 different models that they use. So why they can't decide on one, I don't know.
And CASA, for those who don't know, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, both Paul and I once worked for them, so we sort of know a little bit about it. Back to Paul.
Yeah, and CASA are the regulator for aviation in Australia, so the equivalent of FAA, Federal Aviation Authority in the US, which some people would have heard of. But there's the one that Mike talked about with the culture and company, that's actually a really important influence. So it was good that was identified separately. It does. Each culture, each organisation, pilots have a different experience working for Jetstar and to Qantas Link. Even though they're part of the same group, there is a different culture between each one of those businesses.
Different aircraft types, different rules, different procedures, but one overall safety management system of which human factors, awareness and ability to apply practically is critically important if we want to never have an accident, cross fingers.
Okay, so where else is it critical? You've mentioned hazard. threat and error management. Where else is the non-technical skills training important in the relationship on the flight deck?
So that's a really good question, because when you look at if we look at an airline, for example, so let's pick Qantas. As we said, we're sitting in a 737 simulator that's just like Qantas flies.
Or Virgin, for that matter.
Or Virgin, or Rex, or
that's right.
Bonza, although
Bonza.
they've got Max. That's a different story. So a 737, so we're not plugging any one particular airline. But that's a really good question, because while we're focused on the non-technical skills application on the flight deck to manage error, and there's different types of error. Reason, we make slips, oops, we forget things, omissions, lapses. We have mistakes where we meant to move that lever closed, but we had the wrong knowledge, and we didn't realise that for some reason on this particular aircraft, that's now the flap lever, not the gear lever, and oops, that wasn't what we meant to do, but we didn't realise that. So those are unintentional actions. But we also have intentional actions where we might know what the rule is, the standard operating procedure, but they don't always fit. So sometimes the crew has to think, this is an unusual situation, and for these reasons we have to use our training and modify that with a very clear way of thinking, so we understand that we aren't suffering misperceptions or illusions, or we understand the situation, we come up with this solution, we test it out, we see if we got the right outcome. That's part of that, and that's called a violation. I prefer breach. Violation's got emotional baggage in my mind. So a breach, we normally break a rule for a good reason. We might balance on top of a rickety stepladder because the proper stand isn't there, but we're trying to fuel the aircraft up so it gets away on time, because otherwise, the passengers are unhappy. So we find that organisational influences, what we call performance influencing factors, shape our behaviour a lot. It's only when people willfully try to sabotage something that we can never accept that. So risky behaviour, knowingly, bad, at-risk behaviour where we thought we were doing the right thing but didn't know any better, that's another subtle but critical aspect in our human factors training in the classroom that we then bring into the flight deck and apply it for real. So we're communicating, we've got shared situation awareness, we know what the threats are and we're planning how to deal with them, we see the errors and catch them before they go wrong, we know who's in the team, and so on and so on, if that answers your question.
It does. So my question then is, what happens if we don't use non-technical skills training?
Well, there's a good question. So go back in the old days. So Paul and I, we've been doing this for a while. So back in the day, I'm going to throw this at Paul, he's going to chuckle, there was this sort of unstructured idea, because back then, threat and error management, why I like that, just to slightly digress, it's about observed behaviours, things we can see. So we can we've got people sitting behind us now, we can see what people do, and we can hear what people say. Those are observed behaviours, but we can't see what you're thinking. So I can look out the window behind the pilots, for example, and this is called LOSA. So I can look for threats myself, I can see the bad weather on the horizon, I can hear the radios and the controllers saying, we're going to have to put you in a holding pattern, sorry, because we've got an emergency on the runway, whatever it is. And I can see how you respond to that. And I can see errors. And I can make my notes, observe behaviours, and then later on I can say, I saw you do this, I saw you that, what were you thinking? Because I'm trying to assess in the flight deck or on the real plane, were they identifying errors and threats? Were they managing them? Were they getting out of undesired situations? That's one aspect. Remind me what...
What happens if we don't use these skills?
Indeed. So back in the day, as I mentioned, we had something we called airmanship, which we hadn't thought through. What are these actual behaviours that are good, that we want people to have, that we're training and practising, versus some amorphous idea that you either had the right stuff or you didn't. So Paul, back before we had a sort of this non-technical skills idea, and we went through, as you said, cockpit resource management, crew resource management, and now fifth generation human factors non-technical skills and threat and error management. What did we do back then? How did that work?
Yeah, well, it was called airmanship, and it was never really defined. It was always hard to say what is airmanship and what makes good airmanship within a flight. So it was around the successful outcome of flight, but it didn't look at a lot of the factors that we've now got a structure around. Airmanship was around the knowledge of the aircraft and the procedures and what's going on, and the term situational awareness, which is the broader knowing what's happening or being able to see the outcome that might happen if you did particular action or that somebody else's action might affect you. But the human factor side of it puts more of a framework around it in terms of a structure and how to actually define, teach it and measure it. So the general concepts being anticipation, recognition and recovery. So even having that as part of a framework, I guess, would take human factors to the next level.
And that's lovely, Paul. And when we talked about the difference between threats and hazards, so imagine we've taken off, so we're sitting on the runway here ready for a quick circuit of Sydney Airport, and we can talk these things through in practice. Paul will take us through. But we're looking out there and there's a thunderstorm rolling in. Now that might be a threat. That might mean that we've got to take all the people off the runway, off the tarmac, because it might be lightning strike or it might blow all the equipment around. So it might mean the airport's closed for a while. So there's a threat to our schedule and a threat to things. So maybe we're in a rush to get out on time or early. So there's pressure. Time pressure is one of the biggest error-provoking influences going, as I'm sure you guys would be aware. So that's a threat. And if it comes and hits it becomes a hazard. So the weather's a threat out there, we can manage it, we'll go round, or we'll get off early, or we'll go home for an hour and come back. It's only a hazard when we're exposed to it. And then we've got to have controls in place to manage the threats and the hazards. And of course, errors can come from those. So it'd be really interesting to put that in practice because just coming back to, as you said, how does it work on the flight deck? We look out there, we think about it, we have shared situation awareness, as Paul said, what has been happening, what's happening now, what might happen in the future. We have to check that we've read the situation properly, because maybe we didn't, the wind's blowing quite fast, suddenly it's going to be gone in 10 minutes. Fantastic, I didn't realise that. Oops, we can worry about something else. So we'll talk about some of the real things as we do a quick circuit, whether it's aircraft has blocked the runway in front of us and we've got to go around, or we've got an engine failure on takeoff. That's what Paul trains people in. But it's not just pulling the levers and doing the right thing for that. It's also having that communication. And in the old day, as we said before we had this stuff, really and truly we had the captain, mostly he back then, sorry. It's still quite a male-dominated environment, but we're getting there slowly. He who shall be obeyed, and the first officer was, you don't touch anything without being told, right? Well, and they weren't a first officer, they were a co-pilot. So nowadays we've got captain and first officer, equally respected and trained to take over if something goes wrong. So the poor captain has a heart attack, or often indigestion is quite incapacitating on the flight deck, believe it or not. So when we test before we go flying, I'm safe. Have we rocked up to work well rested, well hydrated, not under the influence of any psychoactive substances? There's checklists. We have checklists to manage these things, but checklists aren't always right, so we've got to have that extra awareness, shared situation awareness and understanding of how to do that. So Paul's going to take us on a quick flight and we'll put some of these things in practice. Okay, maybe before we go on the flight, can I ask the question, have you had an experience where non-technical skills training has either saved your life or saved the lives of others? I very much have. So both Paul and I are safety investigators and it's interesting, you might have heard terms like armchair quarterbacking. So something happens, and unless we're there, unless we know, put ourselves in their shoes and see what they were seeing at the time and understand the decisions they made with the information they had, it's easy in hindsight to go, oh, well, they should have done this or they should have done that. Well, we know what happened. So we've got to be very careful when we're investigating what went right and what went wrong, that we understand the full situation so we can try and change the process and system so it won't happen again, assuming mostly it happened externally, the engine failed or we got distracted at a critical time because the procedures weren't that great, whatever. So I certainly do have some experiences where it saved the day, and there's a recent one that I'm going to hand to Paul because he is a real pilot. He's a air transport airline pilot. I've used to have a private pilot's license, so I do not call myself a pilot. So Paul, he can tell us from either the simulator or real experience, we've talked about this in the past, an event that really did make a difference of those skills in action to save the day. So a regional airline, they tend to do very short hops, so 30 minutes up, down, 5 sectors in a row, and you start to think that you've just done something because it was very recent that you just did it. So this particular example was they were coming to land, 4th sector of the day. When we train people to run the checklist, we train them to touch it, point at it, talk it through, cross-check it, rather than just be busy and just go tick, 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 and become a box-ticking exercise. So it's that. However, if you get distracted at that critical time, and human factors people will know about prospective memory, so the thing we're about to do next, so perhaps you're about to put the milk back in the fridge and the phone goes, and then you look back and the milk's sitting on the bench, because your brain has already ticked that off. So that happens on the flight deck just the same. So when we say final checks, gear down, reach out, get distracted because something happens, you think you've hit the gear down, and there's two biases that are very, very powerful for error provocation and setting us up for failure, what we call expectancy bias and confirmation bias. So we see what we expect to see, and when we look at it, we see what we believe we've just done, so that's confirmation bias. We see that a lot. So this particular example, the crew were on their fourth sector of the day, gear down, got distracted, thought he'd hit it down, called it out, because they were just getting into the habit and they just hadn't quite cross-checked it, like we train. But it happens, we're human, we make errors. So you have a finals check where they check the gear, yep, 3 greens, and then the guy cross-checked it. Hell, we don't have 3 greens. 3 greens, you've got 3 green lights that says your gear's down and locked. And if you look up here, you can see it on the Boeing 737 simulator. We've got nose gear green, left gear green, right gear green. So luckily we're sitting on the ground and the gear is down and locked, because otherwise that'd be a bit embarrassing, right? So the good news was, because of that rigorous training of double-checking, cross-checking, looking across, pilot monitoring, pilot flying, they picked it up and straight to go round, no hesitation. It's much easier to say, oops, we stuffed up, but we saved the day then. And so that was non-technical skills, cross-checking, ingrained habit, even though they got distracted and missed the check. Okay, that happens, but they picked it up. So there's quite a good example that happens more often than not that I'm personally aware of.
That's a great example in actual fact.
There might also be times where you have to breach a company policy or procedure type thing, and I can give you an example of that. So normally if you have an emergency, you'll deal with the emergency, sort it out, and then land. I was in a situation where we actually had a hydraulic failure, but we're very close to landing. We're already configured. We had lots of runway, and we chose to continue knowing that we had a hydraulic leak because it wasn't going to impact, and because where we were, it would have caused more difficulties. We had terrain. We're in a high terrain area, and it wasn't in Australia either, so our lowest safe altitude was something like 11,100 feet, and so we were down at sea level to land. So if we had to go back into cloud and get out, we didn't know how controllable the aircraft would be, whereas we're already stable and coming in, so we elected to continue. We had a very quick discussion between the two of us, and then later on we did an analysis. Was it the right decision? Well, the company says, yeah, you can deal with the stuff before you land, but in this case, because of what it was and where we were, it was actually the best decision to keep going.
And again, that's a great example that these days we train the crew to assess what's the situation, have that discussion. Most times we were trained in an emergency or in an abnormal situation, sit on your hands. Unless you're on fire or you've run out of fuel, you've got time. So you don't want to rush your decisions and get the wrong thing because you're in a rush, because being in a rush causes error. So we literally try and sit on our hands unless it's very time critical, and say what's going on. And the beauty about teaching, even if it's just the 2 crew, sometimes we've got more people on the deck, it's to go around and say, what do you think, what do you see? And the captain has the final determination. They've got the responsibility and the accountability, but rather than them saying, this is what we'll do, this is what we'll do, they say, Sharon, Paul, what do you think? What can you see? And they have that discussion. Then they come up with okay, we think this is what the situation is, this is what we're going to do about it. They try it out, and then they check, did it work? So we've got different acronyms for these different processes we teach people, because the critical thing is when we put them in the simulator for recency training and upgrade training, it's putting them in situations like an engine failure and seeing how they respond and did they do it right. Now, in Australia, we have the ATSB, the Air Transport Safety Bureau, which is multimodal these days, but still called AIR, they published a report this week, literally, about a situation of one of our Australian airlines that had an engine failure halfway across the Tasman, coming from New Zealand to Australia. And in theory, they should have maybe turned back. However, they sat there, they thought through all these other potential implications and situation, and you consider weather and diversion airports and a bunch of stuff. And when you're up at altitude, you have to drift down on one engine because you can't maintain the height, and you've got consideration if you lose pressurization, you might have to go to a lower altitude. So you've got oxygen to breathe below 10,000 feet, and that chews up the petrol faster, so you run out of fuel. So you've got all these considerations. So that's part of the deal. And while they've gone back and analysed everything in great depth, the good news was they didn't, as Paul said, necessarily follow procedures exactly if you just took it black and white. But the report says the crew did the non-technical skill application brilliantly, and it was the right decision what they did, and it was a good outcome. So that's a lovely report that's just come out that people can read up if they want to have a look at it to explain that situation.
I'll just expand a little bit on what Mike talked about, the sitting on the hand. So if you was to give various emergencies in the simulator, and if you have a look at the panels up above you, so there's some an orange light there. So usually what will happen with the crew, they'll get an indication over there with a master caution, and then they'll get a little annunciator beside them that'll tell them what panel it is or what they need to look at. Or sometimes it might just be master caution. They'll look up and they'll see that and make a decision. Rather than sitting on their hands or taking a broader look, they've just identified the very first thing. And I'll often say to them, have a broader look. And then they'll look up and they'll see that there's actually a couple of other blue lights or orange lights further up that are higher priority that they need to deal with as well. So that was a result of that. But if they had have dealt with that, they wouldn't have dealt with the other one that was up in a higher priority. So that sitting on the hands and analysing and gathering all the information is really important.
So that first perception can be misleading. And so sometimes when there's multiple failures, there's other things going on that we have to consider. It's a really good point.
So this is a lovely segue, because really what you've told me is the answer to my next question, which was, how do you teach non-technical skills training? But you teach it in the environment where people are working. Is this correct?
So 3 levels. So first off, classroom-based training. So we'll get people in. We'll go through the theory, if you like, with all these different components leading into what we've been talking about. And we'll use examples. And the beauty is the theory is pretty much the same. But if I'm teaching pilots or cabin crew, and I like to do that together because they need to be a team and understand how they work together, don't forget each other, engineers, and the regulations, the CASA safety regulations have changed not so long back. So it used to be basically you had to have safety management system training and awareness and maybe some kind of competency assessment for safety management systems and for human factors. For people who, let's just say, touched the plane. So the pilots, maybe the cabin crew, the refuelers, the engineers. Now, we've broadened that somewhat, which is great, to people that touch the plane. So people that might not have been trained before, baggage handlers, load controllers, people who, tell you where to put the bag so that you don't tip the plane up out of centre of gravity. People in the what we call the IOC, so this is where you call up and say, hey, I've got a problem, and the rosters and schedulers, because of course that has an influence on our behaviour if we're tired and overworked and overstressed, all these things. So now they have to be trained. So we give them all this base awareness training, and we use different examples to make the point, be it out there on the ramp or on the flight deck or in the cabin. And then we translate that into the job and we say, how do we practically apply it? And in this case, we've got the pilots on board. As they're flying around, we are putting some of these unexpected situations or some of these emergency situations and seeing how they respond and seeing if they use the skills that we've trained them. But as you know, if you don't practice it, it doesn't work. So theory is one thing, putting into practice is everything. And that's why pilots have to do this on a regular basis. We call it recency testing. Every 3 months or something, Paul, I think, these days, yes?
It depends on the airline. Generally, they're doing it every 6 months, but sometimes more often.
And air traffic control is the same. It's the same sort of deal. So we not only get tested for being healthy and have medicals, we get tested on have we done it recently? Because you do, it's not quite like riding a bike. There's a little bit, but it's that there's only so much capacity we've got in our brain, right? So most things, as you know, if anyone here is old enough, I'm not that old really, I am a little bit, to learn to drive a car with a clutch and a manual gearbox. And if you remember back in the day, and you're driving along trying to remember to steer and to indicate and to look for traffic and to change the gear and how fast are we going, after a while that becomes automatic. And after a while you can actually jump in the car to go to the shops and your brain's thinking about something else and you're halfway to work and you think, damn, it's Saturday. I meant to go to the shops, but I've turned the wrong way, because we do that automatically. We can't even tell you what was going on. So that load shedding of cognitive capacity, that leaves us high-level thinking capability to deal with these emergencies. If we're too busy trying to wiggle the steering wheel and put our feet on the brakes and manage the throttles, then we haven't got that spare capacity. So our brains load shed all the time. So we have to have that training, that practice, and do it for real, so that when it really happens, we're not stressed, we're not panicking. We've tried it before, we know what we're looking for. As Paul said, we've got that broader situation awareness. We're not just... And the other problem we've got to remember is something that does impact our performance is distractions like loud noises, warning sounds and buzzes and flashing lights. You imagine when things go wrong, you've got this cacophony of sound, you've got to be able to focus, you've got to be able to have limited selective attention, because we can't. I know the females in this cabin will think they can multitask. I know as a guy I can't. We can selectively change, and doing that we're paying attention to one thing, so we're not paying attention to something else. So that training about methodically looking around the whole flight deck, seeing which lights are which one's the most important, not necessarily responding to, as Paul said, the master warning, caution or alert. Maybe it's because of something else. And what we tend to find in investigations is sometimes it's a bit more tricky than it first looked, and there's something else going on, and so you've got to sort of... and there's some classic, sadly, accidents that have made us look at changing the training that we give people to capture the thing that we learned from the School of Hard Experience, unfortunately. One example, talking about gear lights, was there was an aircraft, Portland, Oregon, years ago. The 3 crew members, captain, first officer, flight engineer, got distracted by looking at a gear indication warning light that actually was spurious, but they didn't know that. And they spent so much time in the hold near the airfield trying to sort it out that they weren't watching the fuel. They literally ran out of fuel, flamed out and crashed. And that got us thinking, oh, there's some extra stuff we should be training these people to do about paying attention to what's going on around us. One person flying, one person monitoring, one person thinking about the emergency. I have control, you have control, you mind the radios, I'll plan the emergency, rather than both focusing on that and forgetting to fly the plane, as we call it. Paul?
Yeah, one of the things with the how is it taught, a lot of the focus is on the threat and error management type tools, if you want to call it that. So there's the overall training in terms of the aircraft and the systems and how to manage that. Then there's compliance with standard operating procedures, integrating checklists, the briefings, which will include the threat and error management and the mitigators with that. And then there's also any other factors and the general human factors principles that are covered more so within the classroom situation rather than it. But certainly if something was picked up during a flight or during a training session, then you speak to them about it. And I mean, I've had a situation actually flying where there was a disagreement between the captain and I on something, but because it was a simulator session and we were both being assessed, I was actually not a trainer, I was actually in one of the seats. And then it was mentioned during the debriefing, and ultimately the checker said, Paul was actually right. So it became a learning experience. It wasn't about putting him down, but it would have just created some disharmony within the cockpit if I had have tried to push it a bit further. And I should have. In a real situation, I would have. But in this situation, it didn't matter. I knew that there was going to be a learning outcome from it as well. And there's been other times, even as a trainer, where I've let things go between the crew rather than pulling them up on it, because I knew that there was going to be a better learning outcome from them getting it wrong and seeing the outcome, and they will never do it again.
And that's a really good point. So that briefing and debriefing, that's what we live by. So every time we're going to do something, we brief the approach, we brief pre-flight, we debrief what happened afterwards, what worked, what didn't work. And one of the things we train these days, because again, if we just say, oh, I'm a bit worried about that weather up ahead, but I'm not going to say anything because I'm a brand new co-pilot, and that's the captain who's been doing this for 40 years, and I'm a bit scared of that person. We've got a model that different acronyms that we call RAISE. So first off, you just did you notice this stuff, and then no response, and then I'm a bit concerned, and we use feeling for that, because I might say I think and I believe, and you might tell me you're an idiot, Mike, that's rubbish, and I go sorry, shut up. We're trying to encourage people to speak up and to listen as well. So that's a key attribute to what Paul was saying, not only in the briefing but also looking out and thinking. So okay, I've made an observation, nothing. I've said, I think we might be getting a bit close to that nasty weather up ahead, still nothing. So if you say I feel concerned, you can't tell me I don't feel concerned. You might not think I should. That's a different thing. So words and framing we train is very, very important. And then raising concern, saying, okay, you've really got to listen to me now, and if they still don't, then there's procedures to say, because we're trained to actually be able to fly the plane, should our other pilot have an incapacitation, or they're so stressed they're not thinking straight, whatever it is. And we train other things these days in terms of recognising what we call distress behaviour and being able to pull people out of that, because you cannot think straight if we're distressed and under stress. So you can't rationalise with the irrational, as we say. So we train that as well. But we have this raised way of showing our concerns, and if it gets to the point that you think they're just not with us, Captain, you must listen, I have control, we take over. So we train that as well, because we don't want people to be sitting there and saying nothing because they're too scared or they don't feel empowered. And we train the cabin crew the same. We want them, maybe not in the sterile cockpit time when we're focused and we're not talking because we're focused on landing the aircraft, but they should know if there's an emergency. Yes, they must bing the bell and say, there's a smell of smoke down here, or did you realise that one of the engines has got big flames coming out of it? Really? So we need that kind of shared situation awareness and that training, first in the classroom, which is facilitated training, adult learning. So we're not training, we're facilitating, and we're using Sharon's experience and Paul's experience to say, tell us these examples and how did you put them in practice, and what were you thinking as a cabin crew, and what were you thinking as a pilot? And then we translate it into the training situation on the flight deck, whether it's assessing, training, upgrade training, recency training, whatever that looks like.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.